All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to First to 13. This is episode 4. Um, we are a podcast about all things Celeste Bingo. I'm Lead. I'm joined by my co-host Crab, and today, um, we're actually joined by a guest, Akko. Um,
Hello, hello.
also, yeah, hello. Also, as always, First to 13 is available on YouTube and Spotify. Links in the description.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know Akko, he was one of the OGs, I should say, when it comes to bingo, and is also probably one of the people that we most wanted to have on the podcast just to talk about routing like this. Do you want to say anything, Akko, before we get started?
Yeah, if y'all don't know me, I am also known as a chocolate orange, and I've spent a lot of time commentating, planning, and running bingo events that you see on Celeste Community. So
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
it's
So
good to be here.
yeah, today we will be talking about high level routing or higher concept routing. If you haven't watched our first episode, or actually it was our second episode on beginner level routing, I highly recommend watching that before this one because we talk a lot about, surface level getting ready to start with bingo and the kind of general routing concepts that apply most of the time. Here we're going to be digging in deep though.
hmm If you've never played Bingo before, you might find yourself a little bit lost. So, be warned.
Yeah, I think we're gonna aim to for this podcast episode to be around the level of advanced and expert. That's not to say that beginners and intermediates you can't watch this because I think you'll definitely be able to gain something from it, but it does assume that you have a foundational knowledge of bingo.
Yeah, on the contrary, I would say that this is the information that you need to take yourself from intermediate to advanced or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's been described before that the big hurdle between intermediate and advanced isn't actually how fast you play the video game. It's more how well you're able to understand what your opponent is doing while you yourself are playing Celeste, which is a tough skill to develop. But yeah,
Yeah,
I've heard that described as a barrier between those two skill levels before.
yeah. And with that being said, I think we're just about ready to hop in. With the caveat that everything that we're gonna be talking about today is in general. Just before we say a sentence, imagine a big IG in front of it. Because while what we're saying is helpful, there are situations where what we're talking about won't apply. Like if you or your opponent go crazy off the rails, uh we can't really prepare for every situation.
Yeah,
I would
sort
say
of.
though that if you follow, I wouldn't call these rules, but if you follow like the guidelines that we're probably gonna set out, and if you just followed them without considering if it's applicable in this situation, I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10 it will be.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And also, sort of to add on to that point, playing bingo is rather difficult. And oftentimes, when you see commentary of bingo, you'll note that the commentators often have different ideas of what to do than what the players actually do. That doesn't mean that what the players are doing is bad. Oftentimes there are multiple valid approaches you can take in a bingo game that depend on all sorts of things. Your specific familiarity in chapters, what do you think your opponent is doing, just knowledge of your opponent. And the point is that in each situation, oftentimes there's a lot of different routes and approaches you can take. And there's the mind games aspects. I mean, you can always just do something that isn't quite correct just to mess with your opponent if you want to. Um, so throughout this, we're gonna say what you probably should do. That doesn't mean it's the only thing that might be an option.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that later when we talk about how mind games and how mentality plays into it, especially in the mid and late game. But
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
why don't we go into early game then?
good. Yeah, so we'll be splitting up this episode into three different parts: the early game, the mid game, and the late game. those are also generally that's the shape that most lockout matches take. So addressing one of those at a time will be very helpful, especially when it comes to mid game, which tends to be the most complicated. So starting off with the early game, what's the first thing you do when you start a bingo game?
Well, you scan the board and you look for objectives on the board and you sort of look for synergies. I mean, we can take a look at this example board right here. One thing I'm seeing is get a 1-up with 1A and get a 1-up with 3 chapters in 3 chapters. That's a synergy. You might see players going for get a 1-up in 1A. It doesn't seem too difficult. Of course, that depends on if you're willing, if you think you have the consistency for a 1-up. If you're not really sure, you might skip it and instead try to go for something like, I don't know, Godless 1A. That's pretty fast.
There's also of note all berries in Awake over here, where if your opponent gets that 1-up in 1A, they're likely to commit further for other 1-ups, and so your job is probably just to beeline for that one, for example.
Yeah, but when you're looking at a board like this, oftentimes the first impressions that you're going to make are early game objectives. But when you're scanning the board, it's also important to look for broader synergies, maybe in the mid game and the late game, that you can start working towards. Looking at this on the board, I do see some synergy between Mirror Temple A side and Barriers and Rescue, but there is also Blue and Red Heart and Mirror Temple Cassette. Both of those intersect with Kill Two Seekers.
Alongside that, there's some stuff that's of note that's past that you could consider a pseudo synergy. So what I mean when I say a pseudo synergy is something that you gain progress towards by doing something else, but doesn't necessarily coincide with the previous objective. So for example, stuff like Reflection, Blue Heart, and Easter Egg Room and Reflection somewhat incentivize you to get the Mirror Temple cassette because going 5B will be faster and will allow you to get into Reflection faster in theory with the same skips as your opponent. And then they also, of course, reinforce each other because they both require some progress in Reflection.
Yeah, so most of identifying synergies correctly on a board comes from, just playing a lot of bingo. Knowing roughly how long objectives take, where objectives are located, where is the fastest places to do some objectives where they aren't, exactly pinned down, and being able to make a roadmap in your head of ways that the game could potentially go. Now that is hard because there is only a minute in prologue, so you're gonna have to compress as much of that thought into that minute as possible.
I mean, yeah, usually during that first minute in prologue, yes, you will be thinking about the whole game and how it might play out. But what you might have to focus on is how you want the early game Tesla to go out. If you're an expert player, walking into those, okay, let me remove the rest of this coloring so it doesn't get too annoying. If you're an early game player, you look at these objectives and you say, I want to get as much as I can, and I want to not get locked out. The first thing you might want to consider here, do I have an execution advantage? If I go for the same thing as my opponent, do I think I'm going to get there first? If the answer is yes, you might be tempted to go for 1-up in 1A, which, feeding into two things, is the most lucrative synergy. So you might go for the fastest things. And then hopefully after get a 1-up in 1A, you might still be able to win an execution check to all berries in Awake. You might be able to get 2 out of these things, which is decently good. On the other hand, if you don't have that execution advantage, you might skip get a 1-up in 1A and immediately lush all berries in Awake and try to get that. So whether or not you have an execution advantage or not can oftentimes define your early game route.
Yeah.
Something else that's very important in early game routing is probably a more general concept, but overall you need to evaluate how important progress is on the board. And there obviously you can separate this into early, mid, and late game, but you also need to evaluate it as a whole. So for example, on this board, again, we see a lot of late game stuff here, right? We have the reflection objectives, we have some summit objectives. And could y'all help me out with this?
Yeah.
What am I missing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of stuff in the late game. And so you generally, in that situation, need to prepare yourself for a game where you will have to go into chapter 6 and 7. And what that means for the early game is that you don't want to commit too hard to objectives versus progress. Obviously, so I will note that this is something that is true on pretty much any board. When you see early game objectives, they can often be bait, basically, because getting that objective loses you enough early game progress that your opponent ends up having a lot more options in the mid game than you do. But again, on a board like this where we see a lot of late game stuff, that's something that needs to be on your mind the entire time.
Yeah, and talking a little bit more about bait, I'm gonna go over two quick things. The first one is, if you're a beginner watching this, you're probably screaming at the screen, why didn't you mark off all berries and intervention in red? That's because, okay, when you're looking at all berries and intervention, that objective kind of takes ages. In an early game sense, it takes like 20 seconds. And those 20 seconds in the early game can matter so much down the line because objectives in the early game, by definition, are faster. So if you are investing time into this objective, for the most part, I'm not going to say this is every time, but for the most part, all berries and intervention is bait on almost every board. And then obviously you need to take a little bit of consideration into what other early game objectives might be bait. In this case, I think 2 optional Theo cutscenes is probably bait.
Yeah.
But
Also, we've marked off get a 1-up in 3 chapters. You wouldn't actually do all of that during the early game. You just get the one in 1A.
yeah,
I think.
Yeah, but it's worth noting because of the synergy with the 1-up in 1A. Also, there's a very obvious thing to point to here with all berries and intervention, which is that with all berries in awake being on the board, if you hypothetically go for all berries and intervention, your opponent does it and sees that get ticked off. They go for all berries and awake. They get the awake berry basically for free, and they gain a progress advantage over you with you both getting one objective out of it. So you lose progress for no objective advantage in that situation. So that's how you would see it as bait.
yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not bait. Sometimes you can get away with doing something like all berries and intervention on a board. Considering we've marked off 6 objectives in late game, indicating that progress really matters, and there's also a couple more fast objectives that play into a progress route, like Cliff Face Berries, Temple Cassette, Kill 2 Seekers. You can get all of those on a progress route, losing very little time. Considering all that, Intervention Berries is definitely not worth it on this board. Sometimes it would be, not now.
So talking a little bit more about what makes objectives bait, there is a term that we like to use in when evaluating this kind of board, saying what is the objective economy on this board, and that's a term. We're gonna say what the term means. Objective economy is the evaluation of how long objectives take on average, and secondarily how much synergy is present on the board. So a board with low objective economy would mean objectives are on average fast and synergize well, and an objective with high or bad objective economy would be a board that has lots of objectives that don't synergize or maybe just take a long time in general. Looking at this board, I would say that the objective economy on this board is pretty low. Objectives are synergized well and in general are pretty low to the ground. So your evaluation of these early game objectives might be different depending on the board that contains them. Like, for example, sometimes Grabless 1A you want to get every time, sometimes it's a given. Or sometimes it's bait, sometimes it's a given. Talking a little bit more about this, in the early game, progress is the most important because obviously a 10-second, 20-second lead in the early game means a lot more than in the late game. In the early game, I would say that an objective is usually worth like 10 seconds of progress, which kind of seems insane, but that that level of progress advantage snowballs down the line.
It obviously, of course, depends on the board. As we mentioned before, everything is conditional here, but there are situations where, of course, you can overcommit to things, and maybe we'll talk about that a little more later. But there's potential for some kind of non-progress play, which we can get into more in mid game. But something we should consider about as we're, I guess, on the later end of the early game, but something that you should still be considering basically from the start of the game is the assist skip and where you're going to use it.
Right. So in Prologue, you look at the board, and one of the questions you should ask yourself is, what chapter do I assist skip? Or more specifically, should I assist skip 3A or not? That is the
Yeah,
question. To 3 or not to 3? That's
to 3 or not to 3.
that's such a good question. Credit to Akko for that, by the way. It's
Yeah,
a
you
very
stole
good
his
quote.
chance to say it.
No, I didn't realize he was going to say it because he was
it's
quiet,
fine.
and then he started speaking while I was saying it. It was awful.
No, you're good. You're good. Anyway, so
All
you
right.
see here that we only have 3 objectives that are like in 3A, and even of those, one of those is not really that's a 3B objective right there, which you're not going to do on the first pass on a board like this. And so what that means is that, as you can see, Crab has conveniently highlighted all of the chapter 5 objectives that are on the board and 4 cassettes. And
Yep.
these are all the things that are incentivizing you to skip 3A, or the main thing. Because the main question, I would say, on most boards is, am I skipping chapter 3 or chapter 5? Because those are typically your biggest single time investments. And while that's not necessarily always the question between those two, because maybe you'll have a board where progress is not as important, but on a board like this where we know we have a lot of late game, it's a question of skipping chapter 3 or skipping chapter 5. And in this case, it's pretty clear to me, and I imagine it's clear to both of y'all as well.
Yeah, you should pretty obviously skip chapter 3 here. Another thing to note is that chapter 3 gets you to chapter 4 quicker. So marked in orange here, all berries and cliff face. If you skip chapter 3, you're going to get there faster, and you might be able to do that faster. So that's another advantage of skipping chapter 3. This board is very clear cut onto 3A or not to 3A. You can be pretty sure that not only are you supposed to skip 3A yourself, your opponent will also skip 3A. You can be pretty sure. You can know that even if you don't see any ticks from your opponent. Because why would they do 3A? It has nothing in it.
Yeah.
It's sort of okay, it's a funny thing to think about. You don't need to worry about if your opponent is doing 3A, because if they are doing 3A, they're already making a bad move. They're already messing up, and you're already at an advantage. So you should just assume that they didn't do 3A. You should assume that they played optimally, and that you are trying to, well, and base your own routing off of that.
Yeah. So the main question of skipping comes down to 3 or not to 3. But if you are not going to skip 3A, that has knock-on effects basically for the rest of the game. And you want to ask yourself, do I have a consistent plan for what I'm going to do in 3A and outside of 3A? So I would say that on around half of boards nowadays, 3A skip is the most meta call. And on the rest of the boards, 40% of the time you're skipping Temple, 8% of the time you're skipping Rage, and 2% of the time, or even less, you're skipping a different chapter. That would be 1, 2, or 7.
It's almost always 2.
Yeah. But so if you are gonna play 3A, not on this board, I would not recommend playing 3A on this board. But if you are gonna play 3A, it usually means that you're going to be playing reactionary, because you're making a play that makes less early game progress, or less mid game progress, I should say. So what you're gonna do depends a lot more on what your opponent does. for example, what are you gonna do if they also play 3A? What are you gonna do if they skip 3A and present progress in 4A while you're still stuck in huge mess? Like, there's a lot of questions that go into that, and like we can make some general claims, and we probably will if we generate more boards to talk about. But for now,
Why not generate more boards to talk about?
okay,
Honestly.
let's do that.
Well, something interesting to note about this board is that there are hypothetically 11 objectives that are achievable without going past Ridge. So when I say without going past Ridge, I do include core and what am I trying to say? Farewell. I do include core and farewell in that diagnosis because both of those are, of course, unlocked after completing 4A. Or sorry, core is unlocked from the beginning of the game, but farewell is unlocked after 4A. But basically, we have 11, maybe it's 12, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
12. Yeah.
Yeah, 12. There's 12 objectives.
Yeah.
Wait, are there 13? What about
Nope, there's 12.
intervention berries?
Oh, right.
Oh.
Counting.
Okay.
Wow.
So
Okay.
this is something that's important to note, both when you're considering your assist skip and as we transition into mid game. But we'll talk about it from the perspective of an assist skip first. So if you see something like this isn't entirely sound because you have to get every single one of these objectives in order to have a non-progress route. So when I say a non-progress route, of course, if you're not aware, I'm saying that we are going to say, screw getting progress, forget about everything in chapters 5, 6, and 7. I'm going to let my opponent commit to that because it looks so appealing, and then I'm going to snag up all these miscellaneous objectives and put a lot of pressure on them in the mid game because I'm doing this strange, wacky route that has a lot more value than it might look like at first glance. The thing with this is if you're the opponent in that situation and you see some of these objectives start to get ticked off, you can start thinking, okay, I did the meta route. I skipped 3A. I went into 5A and started collecting objectives. I know I have a progress advantage, so I don't need to push this that far. And now we can see that my opponent is doing all of these early game objectives. So now I need to go back and contest that. And so there's basically a different mindset that you have to put yourself into based on where you use that assist skip and what you're trying to achieve with the assist skip. And we'll be able to go more in depth into that, I think, as we talk more about the mid game.
Yeah. There is one more thing that I want to talk about. Like, okay, I don't want to drag this out because we could literally talk about one board for an hour easily. But okay, so we've established that pushing no progress on this board is theoretically viable with 13 objectives. But this does bring me into a point that I want to talk a little bit more about, which is A-side or B-side splits, like when you should decide to play the A-side or a B-side. And on this board, as mentioned earlier, there are objectives that work for both the A-side and the B-side. So something that you could do if you play no progress is see what your opponent does. If they choose to play 5A or 5B or neither, that can inform your decision and give you an information advantage on, okay, if I am not quite able to make 13 objectives here, would I be able to clean up the last of my 13 objectives here in Temple by stealing some objectives from my opponent? There's a couple other chapters where A-side versus B-side also matters a lot, outside of Temple, which might be the obvious one because of any percent. The next chapter that I think is probably most important in Bingo is chapter 2, whether you should choose to play 2A or 2B, because 2B loses very little time in relation to 2A, just because, you know, it's a short chapter, you get the cassette at the beginning. So it can really set you up for B-sides early in the game, as well as, you know, other random synergies like cassettes, binos, yada yada yada. And the last chapter that I want to point out for A-side versus B-side is 4B. And I'm going to talk about that one a little bit more in when talking about mid-game routing, because it's kind of a nuclear option.
Mhm. All right. Let me try generate a new board. Hopefully, one with a slightly more interesting mid game. Okay. What do we have here?
All right.
This is the
Why don't
problem
we
with
why don't we
generating
go
boards. We
through
have.
why don't we go through a typical like early game analysis? Just like go through what we just did up until this point, right?
Yeah.
All right.
So what do we see on the board for early game?
Okay. There was City Blue Hut, Crossing Berries, and All Collectibles 1A, but all of those are bait objectives. They take a lot. Well, normally they
I'm
are
not
bait
sure.
objectives.
On this
In this
board, it
case,
might
I'm
not
not
be
sure.
bait. There's also 35 berries on the board.
Hold on.
And start
Okay.
of 2A berries.
Okay.
This
Yeah.
is interesting.
Okay.
Okay. We rolled a funny board.
Yeah. So on this board, I immediately see the synergy between Forsaken City Blue Heart, Golden Ridge Blue Heart, and 3 Blue Hearts. That really stands out to me as one of the best things that you can be doing that defines your early game route. Something else that I see is berries and start of 2A, crossing berries, and 35 berries, which also happens to overlap really nicely. Here, I'll do these in a different color. Crossing berries overlaps really nicely with Forsaken City Blue Heart. The third route that you could take is doing literally none of that. Because they are pretty long things to be going for. So
Yeah.
Well, okay. I feel like if you're not going for any of the 1A stuff, I would still expect you to potentially go for all berries and start of 2A.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
But
fair.
if you choose not to do that, I mean, what do you even do on this board? What a strange early
Let's
game.
see. To 3A or not to 3A? I see 2 mess orders, but you can't get both of them your first pass. I see 5 winged and 7 winged. Resort has
There's
2
also
winged.
2 keys and 2 chapters.
Oh yeah, 2 keys and 2 chapters. It's a little bit. It's not much, but it's a
No.
little.
Also, critically, there isn't a lot in Resort. It's just Golden Ridge Blue Heart. And playing 3A, you have a shot to 3 Blue Hearts.
Oh, there wasn't a lot in Ledge, you mean?
Yeah, there's not a lot in Ridge.
Yeah, you have a shot to 3 Blue Huts. The Golden Ledge Blue Hut is a little bit faster than the Resort one, but you could get it if your opponent doesn't commit to it.
And then what about temple stuff? We have these 2, Rescue Berry.
Cloudless Search if you're playing
Seekers.
5A. It's a slightly tougher call, but I
This is a
think
very
you don't
scattered
3A.
board.
Yeah, I think you don't 3A here.
I think you don't, but there's an argument for doing it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good summit stuff here. Look at this. There's
Yeah.
a lot
oh
of
my
Also
gosh.
Summit Blue Heart. Yeah.
Yeah, there's six objectives worth of summit value. So that in itself incentivizes you to skip 3A because you can get through 5A stuff faster, or even go into 5B. Of course, we do have blue and red in Mirror Temple available to incentivize that, and Stun Seekers can be completed in 5B as well, and that also synergizes with this complete 3B sides that we have over here.
Yeah, what a weird board.
Yeah. I would
Yeah,
love to
so
play
I
this
would-
board, honestly.
Me too.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see a player go for berries early and then one player just beeline their way to 5B. This is I mean, I don't think there's a single meta route that we can define for this one, but this might be a good one to talk about if we're talking about mid game.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see. Well, okay. This is not a particularly conventional board, so I'm vaguely hesitant to talk about it when discussing mid games, knowing that this will lead to a very interesting mid game. Not something
Well,
I see
this
very often, but let's go for it.
Yeah.
Oh.
So
I think this is a great board for talking about progress versus non-progress because there's a very clear route here where you can go progress and you can make your way to summit, and there's also a clear route here that we can evaluate for non-progress, right? So let's talk about
I think
that.
so. Yeah. So when we talk about progress here, I think it would be good to do a little bit of rigorous defining here. Progress is your ability to, well, it comes in 2 parts. One, it's how far you've actually made it in the game so far, and 2, it's your ability to backtrack to objectives that you may have gotten skipped the first time. We'll talk more about that later, or setting up for broader synergies. So when we talk about progress, we usually equate it with the number of objectives in importance, because progress, setting up for more objectives, especially in the early game and the mid game, is more important than the raw objective count. Like if you see a score like 4-7, the person who has 4 objectives might as well be in the lead if they have a significant progress advantage.
Right. And some another way you could think of that is objective access, or maybe you can think of it as like the score that you have is your actual objectives, and then you have potential objectives, and then the combination of those two gives a better prospect, a better view of the value that you have on the board right now compared to your opponent.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, we can evaluate kind of how strong progress versus non-progress routes are on this board by basically counting the potential for objectives depending on routes. So let's just assume that the player who will go non-progress starts collecting these early berry objectives, and the player who will go late progress does not and goes beelining for later stuff. So yeah, we see those for the early game things.
I guess if we're talking later stuff, Ridge Blue and 3 Blue Heads is the first thing that you might want to go for if you're completely rushing progress, followed by, I guess, some 3A stuff. I mean, some 5A stuff.
Yeah.
And then...
in terms of, I guess we should use different colors for mid-game non-progress, right? So let's use the green for potential mid-game non-progress stuff.
And then, as your progress player, you play into Summit and get... Well, you work towards a bunch of Summit things. Okay.
So there are a couple of things that I feel could go both ways, which is the U7 binos and the 3 blue hearts here. Complete 3 B-sides probably goes to the non-progress player. And blue and red in temple theoretically goes to the progress player, right?
Well, it depends. Godless Stitch and Rescue Barrier on boards. I would have played 5A here, but maybe not.
And then all berries and start of 5A is a toss-up as well. So with that, we now have a general idea, and we can count what objectives are safe for either player. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the non-progress player to start. Go ahead, Crab.
Let's just homogenize these to 2 colors, I think.
Sure.
Okay, that seems fine. Alright, so green for our non-progress player and purple for our progress player. So our non-progress player would, assuming they got all the non-progress stuff, and again, a lot of these objectives are fluid, would get 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13, maybe 14 objectives.
Whereas our progress player has, I believe, 10 quote-unquote safe objectives, and potentially 12, and then we have that 13th toss-up with start of 5A berries. Now, when you're looking at this, you may think that this means that the non-progress route is the better one. But on this board, with the conclusions that we've drawn, I would say that this means that the progress route is the correct one to go for. Would you two agree?
I would agree.
I would agree.
And the reason... Yeah, do you want to go into that, Reed?
Yeah, it's a little funny why. The thing is that progress always feeds into adaptability. If you play for progress, you don't need to do everything that's marked in purple, like, all at once. Like, you don't... Like, if you just play to the end of 5A, you don't need to play all the Summit stuff all at once. You can play all of 5A, maybe even play some of Summit, maybe not play some of Summit. But after you're done that, you can go and try and steal things from a non-progress route as soon as you realize your opponent is doing non-progress. And once you steal an objective or two, all you need to get to 13, well, then the rest of your progress is completely safe because your opponent, having done the non-progress route, still doesn't have access to those progress objectives. So inherently,
your opponent, when you go back and steal their objectives, if they cannot reach 13 without entering the Summit at that point, they're forced to to play progress from a severe disadvantage because you have been unlocking that objective access from the very beginning while they haven't. So again, I want to emphasize this idea that the reason the progress route is more valuable here is because of that concept of objective access. You have access to more of the game, you have access to more of the objectives on the board than your opponent, and so you have the opportunity to counterplay them while they basically are, obviously there's still things they can do to play defensively here, and we can get into that, but they are basically at your mercy.
Yeah. So looking at specific objectives on this board, if, let's say you skipped 3A on this board, you're in Ridge, you've gotten the Ridge Blue Heart, and you see the first tick off from your opponent, 5 winged berries. So delays aside, this is probably the first information that you're getting from your opponent saying, hey, I'm in Resort. So, seeing that, you know that they will probably be leaning on the 2 mess orders and 2 keys in 2 chapters as kind of their payoff for playing 3A. So, also 7 wing berries, I should mention. So, if you want to play aggressively, you can look at those objectives as contested. And what that means is your opponent probably has them in their plan to get 13 objectives, and if you want to attack their route, you can most effectively do that by attacking those objectives. So you can do things like get the first few keys in Resort, which doesn't take that long, and set up for getting 2 keys in 2 in Temple. You can go out of your way for extra winged berries. You can play Resort to get the second huge mess order, which kind of cuts off a lot of synergy for them. You could do all kinds of stuff while your opponent is still stuck playing through Resort, because they still need to do that. You have
Like as
go ahead.
Yeah, as soon as you see that 5 winged, you have sort of an information advantage in that you know where your opponent is. And if you're ever in a situation where you are the person with more progress and you also have an information advantage, the game is like yours for the taking. You can choose what you want to do. You can guess what your opponent is looking to put into their win condition, and you can try and take it. You're basically in the driver's seat, so to speak.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about how to mitigate this information disadvantage soon, like really soon.
Well,
So another thing to note with regards to this fight, basically the fight of progress versus non-progress routes, is that I would say it's incredibly rare to see the progress player full commit to progress. It sometimes happens that the non-progress player full commits to their non-progress objectives if there's such a strong, like if there's maybe like 15 potential objectives that you can get without going past 4A, for example, then you can full commit to that and force your opponent to play your game. But as the progress player, you don't have to do that. So for example, if you see your opponent getting City Blue Heart and all berries and crossing, it would make sense as the progress player to then go and get all berries and start of 2A because it removes the synergy with that and 35 berries for your opponent. So you can get that for a relatively low progress cost because you know your opponent committed progress for the previous 2 objectives, and then you can continue on your progress route after getting that.
Yeah.
So it's important to consider, especially when you are the one playing the progress route, to break the synergies of your opponent, and like basically you need to be able to notice if your opponent is going for a win condition like this, or if it's possible for them to go for a win condition like this. They don't necessarily have to be going for it, but if you identify that it's possible, you should be going for an objective like all berries and start of 2A to mitigate that as you continue on your progress route.
Yeah, and the potential for fake outs aside, the way that a board like this will shape up is always defined by what your opponent does, what you do in response to that, what they do in response to that, and so on. So, like, talking about this board generally, like, if both players play progress at the beginning, it could play out totally differently. So you need to make this analysis early, but you also need to be prepared to adapt.
All right. And now I will tell you about the single most important tool when you are playing non-progress. Hold off. Let me untick some of these so that I can simulate an actual. Oh, whoops, that is the wrong color. Let me untick some of these so that I can simulate an actual game. Say you decide to play progress, or no, say your opponent decides to play progress, and they don't tick off anything for a while. They don't go for city blue or crossing berries. Neither of you do, or two-way start berries. And the first tick happens, somewhere in the middle of the game with Golden Ridge Blue Heart getting ticked, and turning purple. And say you've decided to allow the board non-progress, and for whatever reason you've decided to go into 3A. The single most useful tactic that you can utilize once you see your opponent is in 4A is delaying the objectives you have. To deny the person with progress information. Okay. What does it mean to delay? Delaying just means you have an objective. In this case, it would probably be 5 wings, but you don't tick it off. You just keep it in your pocket during the mid game and make your opponent think that you aren't playing a non-progress route. And so your opponent will be forced to commit further into 5A and into Summit because they don't have that information that you've been playing non-progress because you haven't ticked the objective.
Yep.
Of course, you're going to have to take it eventually, well, before they get 5 wing themselves, but you can delay it for just long enough, hopefully.
Yeah. So getting a little bit more in depth about this, let me tell you 2 stories. All right. The first story is the story of you tick off 5 wingberries as soon as you get it, and your objective and your opponent sees that you are in 3A. Your opponent now has the information that A, they're ahead in progress, and B, they have about a minute and a half to do whatever they want before you come to progress parity. So they can go back and do things like City Blue Heart, 3 Blue Hearts, maybe all berries and crossing. And I think all of that is a minute and a half. And this is the story of you, intrepid player, losing the game. So, what happens if you don't tick off 5 wingberries? So, it's important to realize here that 5 wingberries, as much as it is an objective, is also a big red flag that you're holding up to your opponent saying, I am in 3A. So, if you don't hold up that flag, number 1, your opponent is unable to get 5 wingberries until the winged berry in temple, and that's if they get all of the wingberries on the way. So you have a good amount of time before they can tick off 5 wingberries. Number 2, if you give them the advantage or the information that you're in 3A, they have the opportunity to go through story 1. And number 3, if you don't tick off 5 wingberries, your opponent needs to assume that they don't know. Well, first of all, they don't know where you are, and they need to assume the worst case scenario, which is that they are right next to you, and maybe they locked you out of Golden Ridge Blue Heart, or maybe you didn't go for Golden Ridge Blue Heart at all. And if they don't have information, they don't know where you are. They need to make decisions in the dark, and probably play right into your hands.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth noting that a high level enough player on not seeing a tick off after Golden Ridge Blue Heart probably won't play with the assumption that it's locked out.
Mm-hmm.
They'll consider that either they will consider that there's the possibility that you are ahead of them in progress, and they will also consider the possibility that you didn't skip 3A. And in both of those situations, I believe it is good for them to go back for City Blue Heart and 3 Blue Hearts. And so I think that it's worth, as the non-progress player, you should be aware that these are kind of high-value objectives for your opponent to play against the potential non-progress scenario, and you should go back for those, because again, if you can manage to get these objectives, they don't actually signal too much, because again, think about it. Your opponent, hypothetically, if you were in the same position as your opponent, you might go back for those objectives anyhow. So those two objectives are high value in the early game without conceding too much of your information advantage.
So Crab told you all about two different stories. I'm going to tell you all a third story, and this is a very sad story. I think it's a tragedy. So you play Resort, you get 5 winged berries, you decide to delay it, and your opponent plays Progress, completes Lidge, heads into Temple, gets their 5th winged berry in Depths. There's 5 winged berries up to Depths if you get all of them, and ticks it off. Because you didn't realize they were that far and you were trying to hide it. This is the worst case scenario. This is the sort of nightmarish scenario in which you've lost an objective, which sort of matters, especially on this board when there isn't that much non-progress. When you lose an objective like 5 winged on this board, you suddenly have to think, oh no, what do I do? That should have been my objective. I could have ticked that off. It's that I don't need to belabor on why losing an objective is bad. It's first to 13. If you don't get an objective, it's harder to get to 13.
Yeah. Losing an
I will
objective.
say-
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to say that the most important thing when you get locked out is not to panic. I see so many players when they get locked out, they panic. They might quit out of the chapter that they're in. They might, tick off objectives that they should still be holding for their information advantage, out of fear that they're going to lose more objectives, or just like, a sudden knee-jerk reaction. Just don't panic. Think about what you can do to still fulfill your win conditions, or how you need to change your game plan. Go ahead, Crab.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just gonna say pretty much exactly the same thing as that. Don't panic, but also, it is important to realize that over delaying is a 2-point objective swing, because you lose the objective and your opponent gets it. So when you're delaying, some people like having a physical stopwatch on their desk or wherever they play, so that they can visually see how long it's been since you have an objective, and kind of have that benchmark to when your opponent could get it. So this is also where knowing how long objectives take can be really important, because over delaying objectives happens. It's rough. The longer you delay it, the more risky it gets. So you definitely just need to hedge against what your opponent's doing and be safe, but still delay. I don't want to say don't delay, because delaying is very important and it's definitely a skill, but don't just forget about your objectives.
Usually, whenever I decide to delay an objective, I immediately ask myself, okay, how long am I planning on delaying this for?
Yeah.
I don't just leave it as a blank check. I don't just leave it like out there to tick off whenever I want. If my opponent takes off Lidge Blue Hut and I'm in a position for 5 winged and I get 5 winged, I'm thinking, okay, my opponent ticked off Lidge Blue Hut like 20 seconds ago. It takes like another minute and a half for them to finish Lidge, and then like a minute 10 for them to get to the first winged in Depths. So in total, well, a little bit less than that, maybe a minute for them to get to the first winged in Depths. So in total, that's 2.5 minutes. I'll delay it for 2 minutes, and then I'll take it.
Yeah, so, and little bit of free bingo advice here. Okay, let's say that the huge mess order you take on this board is Tells Book's Chest. This is the hard order on the board. This is the order that you should probably be taking. And the 5th Wingberry is the Wingberry in Towels. So instead of thinking, okay, I'll delay it 2 minutes. Like, 2 minutes is step 1. But step 2, in, like, just finding a good place to tick off the objective, is what am I doing 2 minutes from now that will remind me to tick off the objective? Oh, I'll tick off the objective as soon as I enter elevator shaft, or reach demo dash, or whatever. Like, just find a landmark that you're going to be ticking it off at.
I want to tell my own story for this board.
Story 4.
And it's a lot wackier of a story. Okay?
Oh boy.
I know. So this is probably what I'm known for, to be honest, because especially when I'm on call with Jax, when Jax and I are doing commentary, I am always the one throwing out the wacky ideas because Jax is a very level-headed, very, I know what the theoretical best play is, and I'm going to do that kind of player. Though sometimes he's deviated from that. There is a very very nice game where he did completely threw. I think it was Zapri. I think he completely threw
Yeah.
Zapri off. But anyway, I'm beside myself at this point. But yes, my story is one where you go into 3A as so you see your opponent tick off Golden Ridge, Blue Heart maybe. You go for 5 winged and 2 keys in 2 chapters, and then, or sorry, you obviously won't get 2 keys and 2 chapters within 3A. You'll only get 5 winged, but you tick it off immediately, and then you skip 3A.
Yay.
And this is a little less sound than the other things we've been describing, but it can work because it will completely mess with your opponent. Because they'll see this 5 wing tick off, and they will know that you're in 3A. And maybe they will think that you're delaying the other stuff because you didn't think about the timing of 5 winged or something like that. And then you can go and wreak havoc by then going and playing progress, right? So you can get 2 keys and 2 chapters by getting to 5A relatively soon. You can go for all the stuff that's potentially part of your opponent's plan and their win condition, and you can just create chaos by creating a different kind of information advantage, which is confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, 5 winged berries playing into Resort for the second winged berry takes, what, a minute 10, a minute 20? Say your opponent decides to backtrack for these blue heads. 3 blue heads takes like a little over a minute. So if they backtrack for 3 blue heads, you can be ahead of them in progress without them even knowing it. They're thinking you're just chilling in 3A. No, you're ahead of them, and you'll lock them out of something. And trust me, in Lockout, the number one thing you want to do is get lockouts, because they flabbergast your opponent. They make your opponent waste time on things that they thought they were going to get.
Another thing to consider about this play is that it very clearly signals that you have been in 3A and that you've made it to huge mess. And that means that your opponent has a heavily decreased value proposition for going for these huge mess orders, for going for anything else in 3A. Is there anything else in 3A?
Yeah.
I think it's just those two, right? But the value for your opponent of getting those objectives is much lower, and so you don't really need to commit for those on this board. Because it's really unlikely that they'll commit for that at any point in the near future of this game.
It's also worth mentioning there are no objectives in Elevator Shaft and Presidential Suite.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is something that's definitely worth highlighting, where making meta plays is great, they're reliable, but there's a lot of value in being unpredictable, because for every meta play, there's a meta counterplay, right?
Right, for sure.
Definitely.
I think there's a degree to which I wouldn't say it's rock paper scissors, but there's a lot more dynamicism, I guess, to the way a bingo board plays out than rock paper scissors. But certain plays always beat certain plays, and you can use that to your advantage in planning your route in a more robust way. And again, this is just an example of a way to consider, playing an unconventional way to throw off your opponent.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to note, I think we're mostly through mid-game here. I guess we should talk about backtracking, right? I guess we basically have been talking about backtracking this entire time when talking about these mid-game routes. The whole idea of this Forsaken City Blue Heart into 3 Blue Hearts play that we have been highlighting as being very high value in the mid-game here is that you backtrack to get these objectives as the progress player in order to decrease the non-progress potential for your opponent. And then as the non-progress player, these are very valuable in and of themselves to come back for, rather than going on the first pass, because going on the first pass you're wasting a lot of time that could potentially matter in the mid game if you need to have a more, obviously more progress is more options. Coming back for these is relatively low cost, so it's better to go for the later objectives first if you can afford it, and then come back for those. But it's still good to come back for these relatively soon, since your opponent probably has their eyes on them as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So when talking about backtracking, the main question that you will probably ask yourself is, why am I not doing these first pass? Like, what advantage am I going to get from doing these objectives by coming back? So there's a couple considerations that you need to do. If you plan to backtrack to objectives, it's important to ask, do I think my opponent's going to do this on the first pass? Because then obviously you can't fall back on those objectives, and it's impossible to backtrack because they're already taken. Uh, Beyond that, most of the time when you're backtracking, you're giving yourself more options for what you're able to do in the mid game. For example, if you do Forsaken City Blue Heart and 3 Blue Hearts first pass, your opponent is most likely ahead of you, so you have less options for how you're going to move forward. If you come back for these, you have the option to come back, or you have the option to keep playing. You'll have more progress already, so you have more opportunities to do other things like a huge mess order or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
say you decide, okay, I want all 3 of these objectives. I'm gonna go get City Blue Hut. Your opponent doesn't get City Blue Hut, and they just go for Lidge Blue Hut and take it. So instead of getting 3 objectives, you only get 2, and your opponent is ahead of you, which means they have an advantage. Other color. Which means they have an advantage to a whole host of other stuff in 5A and Summit. So it's
So are you saying the scenario where both players are going for the same 3 objectives, like both of them are planning to get City Blue Heart, Ridge Blue Heart, and 3 Blue Hearts?
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about the scenario where purple is planning to get City Blue Hut, Site Blue Hut, and Ridge Blue Hut, in that order, whereas blue, is planning on getting Lidge Blue Hut and then backtracking for the other 2 Blue Huts.
Right, and then blue ends up with the advantage because they have the progress. Yeah, that's pretty sound.
So that's sort of what ends up happening here. And so the more of the story, I guess, is that backtracking is good because, well, if you lose those objectives, you still have an advantage to other things.
Yeah. The classic example for backtracking is Pico 8, because for the most part, you're not going to be doing Pico 8 first pass. You need to hard commit. You can't save progress in Pico 8. So like you're going to be backtracking to that. So deciding when to backtrack and how high value the objectives that you're backtracking to is a really important question. For example, what happens if there's only 1 Pico 8 objective? What happens if there's 2 or 3? What happens if there's additional reason for your opponent to try to get to Pico 8 if there's extra things in Resort, like for example, second huge mess order? It's all about when you think your opponent is going to backtrack for it, and if you want it, when are you going to backtrack for it? Are you going to backtrack first? Are you going to force them into backtracking so that you can take progress? It's like 4D chess.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
A big part of that as well, especially with something like Pico 8, I often see Pico 8 ending up in the late game as an unticked objective. And on a lot of boards it's reasonable for that to be the case, but it's just something to consider as like a question of what is my opponent's win condition, right? And it's something that you have to keep in mind when you're doing your mid game routing, because let's say there's going to be 4 objectives left on the board when you're at what would be a scoreline when there's 4 objectives left on the board? I can't count. Okay, it's like 11-9. Okay, it's 11-9 and there's 4 objectives left on the board. If the player who's at 9 has the progress advantage to all 4 objectives, they have a chance of still playing into the game. So when you're in the mid game, even if you're going to put yourself in a position where you're having less objectives, if you're considering your progress versus your opponent's progress. So again, for example, something that I mentioned on this board was these huge mess orders. if you did something like that 5 wing berries and then skip, these huge mess orders become something that you are carrying into the late game as a progress advantage. And when I say progress advantage in this context, I mean progress advantage towards a specific objective rather than an overall broader, like, more progress in the game. And so generally what this means is that you want to identify both your own and your opponent's win condition, and it usually does you more benefit. This is very generalized, and I think this is less true than most things, but usually I would say it's better for you to play to disrupt your opponent's win condition than to try and complete your own. It's only good to be aggressively pursuing your own win condition if you are, say, the one with 11 objectives versus 9, and you know that there are 2 objectives that you have the advantage towards and you can put pressure towards. But otherwise, I would say you should be disrupting your opponent's win condition. And do you guys have anything more you could say on that idea?
Uh, I think you covered most of it.
I
uh,
think
Yeah,
we'll
funny
be able
enough.
to get more into that in the late game as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
there is one last
definitely.
thing that I want to mention is before we move on to the late game is, and this kind of feeds into your point, Akko, is don't get lost in the sauce either. And what I mean by that is don't spend your entire game disrupting your opponent, because disrupting your opponent is a great thing to do, but if you spend your whole time doing it, you still need to actually win the game to win the game. So the most important thing to this is don't try to extend your influence over too many objectives at once, because it's not worth it. If you try to claim 16 or 17 objectives in your route, A, you're not going to be able to hold all of that influence. You're going to lose some of those objectives. And B, you don't need 16 objectives to win. You only need 13. So playing to 13 is, and maybe with 3 or 4 objectives on the side that you want to directly contest from your opponent, is usually a lot better than trying to claim a lot of objectives at once. And by claim, I just mean signposting that you have progress to them and you're planning on including them in your win condition.
Like, yeah, let me give a slightly more concrete example for that sort of thing. Say that you're purple, and you've ticked off, I don't know, these objectives more or less, and your opponent has ticked off, I don't know, a couple things in 3A, maybe costing berries, maybe all collectibles 1A or something instead of 2A berries or something. 35. You finish out 5A, you tick off this stuff. Okay, great. And you're in this position. It might, okay, right now, you have 6 objectives. It might be really tempting. Well, okay, it might be really tempting to head to try get objectives that you immediately have access to. All berries instead of 5A. Or maybe 7 winged berries. You're decently close to that, and you might try to head into resort and try and steal the other huge mess order. But the more time you put into that, you're not really playing to 13 objectives. You have the progress lead, and there are 6 things in Summit. Well, there.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are 6 things in Summit, so this is 12. You only really need one thing outside of Summit. You don't need to head into 3-8 and try get 7 winged and the huge mess order.
Yeah,
So
I mean, you can actually get 7 winged in Summit.
yeah, you can get 7 winged in Summit, for example. But you don't need to like try and snipe objectives that you don't like, that you aren't necessarily advantaged towards if you have a clear way to get to 13. And in this case, your clear way to get to 13 would be like all of Summit plus, I don't know, either Winged Gordon, Blue Leaden Temple, something like that.
I do want to give a voice for the opposite side as well, which is that you can fall into the same trap by overcommitting to your own game plan as well. And so what I mean by that is that, like, if you're winning on progress, if you're ahead in progress to a significant degree, you don't actually have to go. Like, let's say your opponent was doing 3A and you know that you have a couple minutes on them. You don't need to go into Summit right away on completing Chapter 5 because you know that you have that advantage. and if you're trying to roll that progress advantage further. So I mean, this is actually even more relevant before you even get to 5A, I would argue.
Yeah.
Because if you're ahead in progress before going into 5A, then continuing and completing, well, 5A or 5B, whatever route you go through chapter 5, continuing and completing that is pushing your progress advantage further when you already have a really big progress advantage. Because, you know, in this scenario, your opponent spent time getting all collectibles in 1A and going all the way through 3A. You have a big progress advantage at the moment, and you don't need to push it right now. If you invest further into progress advantage, the value, the marginal value that you get is a lot lower than the first couple minutes of progress advantage. And so you will get more value out of that time by going back and getting a couple miscellaneous objectives from your opponent, because not only will this disrupt them, it'll also force them to play towards your progress, right?
Yeah.
And so this is something. So personally, I think of this as win percentage versus win margin. You're not trying to win by just stacking up what you have to the maximum amount. It's playing the highest percentage play. And in this case, in the case that I'm laying out for you, the highest percentage play is to go back and take a couple objectives from your opponent.
Yeah.
But obviously there are other situations, as you two laid out, where it would be better to play to your objectives as the higher percentage play.
Yeah. So it as always, it comes down to a consideration of on a game by game basis. For example, your decision might change if you had a major execution moment in Temple and progress lines up a lot closer because of that. Or you suspect that your opponent played 2B first pass, which means that they might be able to snipe you 7 binoculars early. Or maybe you know that your opponent is a winged golden fanatic and fucking loves that objective and is probably going to do it earlier. So it's all of these considerations that make either going into Summit or attacking your opponent's game plan more or less compelling.
Yeah. I think another small thing to note when we're talking about this is something that I mentioned briefly before, which is that you don't assume that you locked out your opponent. And obviously, this is in general. There are some cases where it is important for you to make that assumption, but for the most part, if you assume that you locked out your opponent, then you're playing for win margin rather than win percentage, right? Because if you already are in a situation where you locked out your opponent, you already have a big advantage over them. And so you don't really need to play towards that situation, because if you're in that situation, you're already winning by some margin. So you should play around the potential that they were doing something else that could skirt around whatever your plan is.
Yeah.
Obviously there are some cases where, like, you know, if you did lock them out, then you need to react to that, because that is the lower percentage situation, basically. Like there could be some, for example, let's say there is like a specific B-side on the board and then there's 2 B-sides on the board. Then there's potential that the situation where you locked out your opponent of the single B-side is your lower win percentage situation. And if that's the case, then you should go and work towards 2 B-sides. But if that's your higher win percentage situation, if your opponent committing to 2 B-sides is good for you, then you just ignore that and keep going as if, you know, as if your plan never changed.
Yeah. So with that, I think we can probably move on to the late game.
All right. I think I'm going to generate a third card. This late game is very boring.
Sounds good.
There's not much on it, to be totally honest. All right, here we go. Attempt number 3.
What do we have here?
What are we looking at as far as the late game goes? Okay, there is some slightly interesting late game going on here, in that there's more than one path to take in this late game. Oh my gosh, 15 and 4 and 10 and 5. Ew.
Okay.
Ew.
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, so we see some berry options and some very strong B-side synergies, I feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on this board, in the late game, uh, actually, first let's try to construct, like, how this board might look.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Let's go through the
Okay.
early and mid game real quick here
Yeah.
to make it
Super quickly.
So let's say blue gets 10 berries in 1A. I think there's probably an argument for early 20 berries with berries and intervention 20 berries, so let's just roll with that.
Yeah, I
in
mean
the
this.
meantime,
This is a very nice board for showcasing one of the big dichotomies in bingo routing, which is you often have boards where you have like one player going for an A side berry heavy route and one route where it's B sides and heart heavy.
yep. In the meantime, the other player is going to go, let's say, blue hat, and is going to play 2B, actually, to capitalize on a bunch of B-side synergy. They're probably not going to get all of this right away. Complete 2 B-sides, 3A, 3 B-sides, 5 biners and B-sides, and 5 hits. They're not going to get all of those objectives, like, immediately, but there will be advantage towards it.
Yeah.
And so we might as well make them that color.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's just make some assumptions here and try and clean things
I don't know
up.
about Rescue Berry. Hold on. But
Rescue
the other,
Berry? Well, I feel
yeah.
like I guess you
Yeah.
probably don't go 5A. Yeah,
Yeah,
you go
I
for
think the B-side player plays 5B, so it gets Temple Cassette and kill 2
Temple Cassette
Seekers.
probably goes through.
Yeah.
But then the
Yeah.
A-side player might go 5B. Well, actually, okay. Seeing your opponent go the B-side route, you might just commit 5A for the Rescue Berry.
Yeah.
Because your opponent is, I mean, okay. Your
Wait, you
opponent
can't
probably
give
could
them
still
Resort and Temple and Ledge. Hold on.
Well, it's Temple A side, right? Because your opponent's going to Temple B side, right?
Yeah. Let's say that
Oh,
they
yeah,
skip.
but, like,
Let's say that they skip Rage. They get Key and Search and Rescue Berry and all 4 optional Teo cutscenes.
okay.
Sure.
And
So
sure.
now we
And
have a late game.
Yeah.
If we assume that both players are
okay, we have admittedly we have a
relatively
late game
equal
that is 12-8. So
Yeah.
this is
Well,
probably
I
not
think
the
this is
best late
good.
game.
I think this is good actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's talk about from the perspective of the player who has 8 objectives. So your opponent might have stomped you in the mid game by skipping Ridge. Let's say you also no, you played Ridge. Sorry, you played Ridge because
Yeah, you played
Yeah.
Ridge and you played the A side, so you get Old Trail Berries, right?
yeah.
Mhm.
So on this board, you're probably coming out about even out of Temple. Maybe the blue player is even a little bit ahead of you, and there's 2 objectives in Summit and there's 2 objectives in Reflection. So this is a really interesting look at kind of what we call late game mind games, I should say.
Or actually, let's change the scenario a little bit so that Pink gets a slight advantage for what they've been doing this whole time.
Okay.
I
5
think they do
cassettes.
have an advantage.
Yeah, well, 5 cassettes was ticked off with Reflection because, well, they didn't get Resort cassette because they skipped Resort.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
say they have Reflection cassette access. But that's it. That's all the advantage they get, and aside from that, progress to everything else is about even.
Yeah. So the blue player needs 1 objective, and you need all 4. So what would you do in this position?
Well, it's a tough call to make.
Yeah, it is
You
a tough
could-
call.
The thing is, you have ticked off 5 cassettes, and you've sort of indicated that you skipped 3A by just not doing anything in 3A, or maybe the timing of your Temple cassette tick will give it away, or something like that. But you've given away the fact that you've played 3A. I mean, that you skipped 3A. And you've ticked off 5 cassettes, which means you have Reflection cassette, and your opponent knows that.
I'm
So
gonna
maybe
I'm gonna untick that one because that one usually uses Summit.
that you one usually uses what?
Summit.
Oh, Summit, yeah. And so usually you think to yourself, okay, I'm advantaged to the 2 Reflection things. I know I'm advantaged to the 2 Reflection things. So
I
I
mean,
think I'm going to go Summit to try steal all berries in 1500 meters and all berries in 2500 meters.
I
and
also want
by
to note in this situation, this probably wouldn't be ticked off.
Yeah.
that's fine.
So, but it's just, this is very clearly a pink objective. It's really unlikely that the blue player would ever get it, and this is very clearly a blue objective. It's really unlikely that the pink player would ever get it. But yeah, I agree with the 1500 meter berries call. I feel like as the blue player, I would expect this though, and then I would try and get Easter egg room and reflection, because my reasoning is if my opponent ticks off Easter egg room in reflection, I can go and go into summit and try and get 1500 meter berries, and if that gets ticked off, I now basically can multitask rock bottom and all berries in 2500 meters.
Yeah.
And so I'm in a good position to win the game regardless.
So there's a lot of like what would happen if another thing happens. So obviously, like it comes down to mind gaming your opponent. But I'm gonna reiterate what Akko just said. So blue player, who currently has 11 objectives, is very advantaged towards 10 berries and 5 chapters. So the obvious play for them to make, barring mind games, would be to play Summit, because there's berries in that chapter and there's no berries in Reflection. But they only need 2 objectives to win, and there happens to be 2 Reflection objectives. So if they get both of those, and by getting Easter egg room and reflection, they're very likely to get Grabless Rock Bottom. They can win without the 10 berries and 5 chapters, so it might make more sense for them to go to reflection.
And then there's also the third option here, which is to treat 10 berries and 5 chapters as a safe objective, which, given the tick-offs, I think you could pretty safely conclude that. And then just think of it as, I need 1 objective. What can I get here? Right? And maybe the answer here could even be to beeline for something like Grabless Rock Bottom or all berries in 2500 meters. That's another option you have, where you can just ignore everything else that's before that, because your opponent, as the pink player, is kind of forced to go for one or both of these 2 in order to stop you from outright winning the game. And so as the player with the objective advantage, you kind of have more room to play around the board, and as the player with the objective disadvantage, you have to make reads and really good delays. So as I do think, as the pink player, what I would expect, because I'm thinking of what I would be doing as the blue player. If I'm the blue player, I feel like I probably go, there's two it's so hard actually.
Yeah.
Because as the blue player, I think I'm pretty happy with trying to get Easter egg room and reflection. And I'm also pretty happy going for all berries in 2500 meters and just hard committed for that.
Yeah.
So as the pink player, I think what you need to do is probably grab this and then delay it long enough to get into 1500 meters probably, and hope that you catch your opponent off guard.
Yeah.
Yep, that's definitely the play.
So go ahead.
The final third thing that you can do in this situation is multitask. Well, not third thing. There's many things you can do in this situation, but one thing you could do is multitask. So, for example, Grabless Rock Bottom, you can do that a little bit faster by doing it in 6B instead of 6A. So, as the blue player, you only need one thing outside of 10 and 5. So, what you might do is head into 6A, get the Reflection Cassette, and play just a checkpoint of 6B. Not a lot, but just a little bit, and then head into Summit. You play just enough of Reflection so that if your opponent spends the time to play all of Reflection, then you'll stay ahead of them in Summit and you'll win something in Summit. But if your opponent instead goes to Summit and takes off something in Summit, you can quit out and you're advantage to Grabless Rock Bottom in Reflection. And yeah.
Go ahead.
That's sort of the idea of multitasking. It's to put yourself into a situation that such that no matter what ends up happening after the objectives get ticked, you can still like win the game.
Yeah, so bringing up multitasking, sorry, I can't speak for some reason. Bringing up multitasking brings up an interesting point here, which is that we've been talking about this kind of what I would call a level 1 50-50, which is where you are between either picking Reflection or picking Summit as the place to get your final objective, right? And then, but when you bring multitasking into it, you create this level 2 50-50, which is between multitasking and hard committing for the player who's advantaged, and then for the player who's disadvantaged, it's between it's basically a game of delays. Um, and so what I mean by that is that you have essentially a rock paper scissors situation where if your opponent is multitasking and you're delaying, basically if you get the perfect delay on an opponent who is multitasking, you can lock them out of both objectives, and that is your way back into the game. On the other hand, if you do some kind of crazy delay like that and then your opponent just hard commits for an objective, then you just lose out. On the third hand, I don't know why I have three hands here. If you delay something and your opponent hard commits to that specific objective and you tick it off perfectly, then you suddenly have a huge advantage because you are working towards other objectives and you've locked them out of that one. So it's this, I don't know if you can call it a 50-50 at that point, but I do just call it a 50-50 because I'm extending the language that we already use. But it's like, instead of just thinking about the objectives themselves, think about the ways that you and your opponent can approach those objectives, and think about how how those approaches interact with each other.
Yeah. And unlike when you're multitasking in the mid game or delaying in the mid game, a lot of this is done by feel and by knowing your opponent. There isn't a lot of concrete information that you can use to dictate when you, or for how long you delay objectives, which objectives you should go for. At some point, it comes down to knowing your opponent, knowing your position in the game, and luck. Not gonna say that it's 100% skill. There is an element of luck to this.
I mean, there's a reason we're calling them 50-50s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it comes down to a read in the end.
So yeah, in the
A
late
lightning
game,
read.
you're trying to shape the board position so that you're advantaged in the 50-50, so that it's actually no longer a 50-50. Maybe it's a 75-25 or something like that. Like it's still, there's still a chance of losing, still a coin flip, but you can definitely weight the coin in your favor.
Mm-hmm.
Something else to note that isn't too relevant with the way that we've played out this board, but is a generally important concept to mention, and probably like, okay, the objectives that we've ticked off on here might be a little unrealistic because if generally if you see your opponent committing to one side of the board, you will try and do something to disrupt. I'm sure I'm not sure what the specific option here is to disrupt. Maybe it's going
Like
5A
5A.
as the B-side
Yeah.
player. Yeah.
I
And
think there's
so
also an argument for going 10 berries and 5 as the B-side player, like making progress to that.
for sure.
Yeah. It's possible.
So
And
something
15
to
and 4.
consider in that regard is that we want to also be aware of our opponent's safe objectives and not let them feel safe in having their safe objectives. And so what I mean by that is, if your opponent thinks an objective is safe, they might not go for it for a really long time. And if you can steal that from them, it can completely change the dynamic of the late game. So again, something like 10 berries and 5, like we were saying, could be a big deal in that regard.
Yeah, and suddenly now it's a 10-10 late game.
Yeah. If your opponent thinks, okay, I've ticked off 10 berries in 1A and 20 berries, I have an advantage to 15 berries in 4 and 10 berries in 5. I'm just going to play all of 3A and 5A without getting any berries. Well, you can capitalize on that opportunity to steal those two objectives, and this late game is a lot more winnable now. It's 10-5, it's 10-10, well, almost 11-10 considering 3A sides and 3B sides. And now your opponent is the one sort of stuck trying to figure out what to go for, which of these two options to take, because you need something in Reflection or you need something in Summit, and it's a little bit ugly.
Yeah, so
Okay.
this is just the butterfly effect of how mid game can affect late game. but it's also important, like, once you're in late game, the mid game has already happened. Think about the late game from where you are.
Can't change the past or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yep.
So with that, I think we are, well, first of all, we're very over time. But second of all, I think this has been really good, just going through these boards and explaining rationale behind decisions that we might make, pointing out some of the important things to look out on boards. Do either of you have any additional things to mention?
I just want to say I feel like we got super lucky with these boards. Like the first one was great for talking about early game, the second
I
one was
know,
great
right?
for talking about mid game, and the third one was great for talking about late game.
Yeah.
I swear,
I'm
I
glad
didn't
that,
see these
yeah.
boards.
Yeah, we
I
live
just
generated these
completely
boards.
randomly generated them. Crazy how that happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you want to see more live generated board action, there I think we are planning to have a live stream at some point with probably the three of us, maybe just Reed and I, if scheduling doesn't line up. But we will be live on Twitch at some point. If you have any questions or comments about this episode or routing in general that you want to ask us, that would be the time, because we're planning on just taking questions, probably playing some bingo on stream to help these concepts become more visualized, and we'll have information about where to find that and when in the description, so make sure to check there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way we're going to cover every possible scenario or like every aspect of routing within this hour and a half, but I think we did a pretty good job of getting all of the important points here.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Something else that I recommend is watching past expert binge matches if you have the time and the energy for it. Especially the last two expert binges in the semifinals and the finals. Particularly two expert binges ago, the finals versus LM Jax and Zapri are very good masterclasses of bingo routing. See if you can apply these concepts that we've been talking about to those games.
Yep. I believe the finals are spread over 2 different Twitch streams, both highlighted on twitch.tv/Celeste community. So feel free to check that out.
I would also definitely I would recommend watching the ones that we did on GDQ as well, because on those Crab and I, as well as Jax and TrueGen, we all tried to be as educational as possible about what decisions players were making and why they were making it. Of course, I still try to do that in regular binges as well, but it's to a more in-depth degree in the GDQ one. So if you're more of a beginner or intermediate player, that might be a good place to start, but also going to the expert binges and the other ones will give you commentary that does have analysis, but it will probably be only the high-end stuff because you're expected to have the base level on those.
Yeah. So with that, I would like to thank Akko very much for joining us on this episode
Yeah,
of
of
First to
course,
13.
it was a ton of fun.
Yeah. And thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you all next week.
Yeah. Take care.